Okay, the circumscription of his ideas in Being and Time, um, mainly to the interface of the individual and world, or Dasein and world. And you can sort of try to trace the lineage, of sort of thought or influence that um, makes Heidegger gravitate to sort of the unit of analysis being more or less the individual or Dasein. Of course, the word individual does not capture what the term Dasein is meant to signify in Being and Time. Of course, Dasein is inextricable from its environment. It's inextricable from its milieu. Um, any sort of human being is, to use a kind of a more modern word, coupled with its environment in such a way that its um, projection of signification, of world, of meaning is both inherited from the signification or meaning that was prior to it coming to the world, but it is also it fits in a set of modes of comportment that it has, so to speak, fallen into, and that's the Heideggerian notion of fallenness. So in a nutshell, Heidegger, what's considered his magnum opus, Being in Time, is a work that sets to to raise again the question of capital B being, the question of the meaning of capital B being, anew, since there's intimation, or rather explicit assertion, that this question may have been covered over through the millennia. And so we want to discover what is meant by being. Not beings, but being. And for those of you who are knowledgeable already of Heideggerian thought, that's the ontological difference, the difference between beings, particular beings, and being. Of course, in a non-Platonic way, as Heidegger would say. So so Being in Time, as I said, is largely circumscribed to the unit of analysis being Dasein, or the human being. Heidegger opts for a phrase like Dasein in order to defamiliarize, to sort of remove the metaphysical assumptions that come with both everyday, ordinary language vocabulary and scientific vocabulary. So he opts for something that's neither ordinary nor scientific, but that's more sort of poeticized, but also that fits in an entirely new vocabulary, and a vocabulary that tries to capture the existential structure of the human being. So Being in Time is a phenomenological, right? Its methodology is phenomenology. It's a descriptive project. It's not an explanatory project in the sense that much of science and certain philosophy is. It's not trying to give causes for why things they weren't the way they are. It's trying to give a high-level description of a phenomenon, and the phenomenon and the starting point, as Heidegger states in the outset, in Being in Time, the natural starting point is the being for whom its own being is an issue, which is the human being. So that is the rationale for starting the investigation with the human being that he terms Dasein, which Dasein translates roughly to being there, or as others have translated to being open. And so, what unfolds in Being and Time is the existential analytic, what's called the existential analytic of Dasein. So, Heidegger's thought rests on this distinction between ontic and ontological, existential and existential. And the difference, roughly speaking, between ontic and ontological is that ontic is to do with empirical matters, whereas existential has to do with fundamental structures. So every sort of empirical going on, every empirical observation, every ontic concern has an underlying existential, ontological constitution. So now, someone who's critical of Heidegger can, of course, question the cogency of the distinction between ontic and ontological, but in a nutshell, it is this rough divide between something that concerns empirical goings on, and ontological concerns something that probes the fundament. And so the human being's concern with itself, everyday concern with itself, is more or less ontic. And it's ontic, and its issues are existential. So when a human being wonders, whether it should pursue academia, or whether it should go to college, or whether it should live the lifestyle of a vagabond, all these sort of concerns with its own life and its future, and how these fit societally and societal expectations, and all these sort of questions are ontic existential concerns, and have an ontic character. On the other hand, what Heidegger is undertaking in Being and Time is an existential project. He is seeking to uncover the structure that underlies all of sort of human concern, comportment, human involvement in its environment. And as we'll see, this has a structure, and it has a structure of fallenness. Well, let's see here. So it has the structure of thrownness, fallenness, and projection. Its facticity, and so Heidegger presents the two different divisions of Being and Time. The first division concerns average everydayness, right? What life is in its thrown and fallen state, right? Thrownness means the sort of facticity of the human being. It's thrown in a set of arbitrary circumstances that are outside of its control. Fallenness means that it has inherited the significance of its world, and what are the possibilities of its acting out in that world. So the world that Dasein swims in is not of its own making. It is a world that is infused with this sort of cultural mores and values and meanings, and those are the lenses, the overlay of signification that Dasein both sees the world, conceptualizes it, and acts out in it. And the most important, in my view, there are several concepts. There are certain ideas in Heidegger that are far more fundamental to his thought, or perhaps I'm more interested in them than other ideas. One of them is, and especially in the chapter, the worldhood of the world in Being and Time. That is one of the most important chapters, because Heidegger's characterization of world, in my opinion, is one of his most interesting contributions to philosophy. And it goes hand in hand with the difference of Heidegger's approach to phenomenology as compared to Husserl's approach to phenomenology. Now, of course, there are all kinds of aspects of the differences between these two philosophers that are still a matter of ongoing debate, but in a nutshell, Heidegger is a non-reductionist philosopher. His phenomenology is non-reductionist in the sense that he is describing the phenomenon at the highest level of revelation or disclosure. So, put another way, what reveals itself in itself, right? So the definition of phenomenology, as Heidegger engages in creative translation of Greek, ancient Greek language and thought, is that which shows itself in itself. Now, without getting into the nitty-gritty of parsing that phrase, that which shows itself in itself, in Heidegger, we're trying to describe the situation as it reveals itself at its highest level of analysis. We're not trying to reduce it. And so when you ask, well, what does the world reveal itself like to you from moment to moment? Well, it is some situation of coping know-how. And this is where what I'm saying sounds like Hubert Dreyfus, who was one of the foremost interpreters and Heidegger scholars in North America, in the United States. And Hubert Dreyfus was a great Heidegger scholar, and but mainly his interest was circumscribed or limited to Division 1 of being and time. Anywho, so the way the situation shows itself from moment to moment is this sort of task that you are engaged in, right? So you're engaged in something, and then you disengage from it and you move on to some other engagement. So there's this sort of, to use a metaphor, swimming or towards some sort of like attentional state, and that state can be engaged or it can be disengaged. And one of the reasons why I'm so interested in Heidegger, and I think Heidegger is such an astute, both perceptive philosopher as well as thinker, and same with other thinkers like Kant, is that they, and this is controversial within their systems, but I see a lot of their claims as hypotheses that can be vindicated empirically through experimental science. So Heidegger's description of modes of engagement and moods, and I'll get to what he means by fundamental moods. You're always already in a fundamental mood, just as you're always already in a world. So the human being is never sort of separate, decoupled from some milieu, some environment that has valence, right? So the environment constitutionally has valence. What I mean by that, it's the environment is not this physical material artifact that science later describes it to be. That's the secondary description. That's the presence at hand description. The way that the environment shows up to you is not as this physical artifact that is the same for everyone. No, your environment is the most proximate sort of objects and people and beings that it's populated with, and he doesn't restrict the term being to physical things or to other human beings, but words and mythical beings and wizards and witches and all these things are beings that populate your world. Now, of course, in our, let's use the word modern context, we live in a demystified or disenchanted world where most people do not give credence, or they don't live in a way that's proximate to these imaginary beings, or they were not imaginary. They were not considered imaginary then. They're just invisible. But just as easily, you can imagine human beings in the past who lived in a world to whom these types of beings, albeit most of the time invisible, were real and concrete, and it populated their world. So the world is that which you swim in, is the web of signification through which you're in intimate and proximate contact with as you swim through engagement, disengagement with it. And so that is what is meant by describing the situation at the highest level of analysis. Heidegger is not trying to sort of reduce it to its components. He's trying to describe it as it shows itself in itself. And so, for example, if I were to say, well, how does the world show itself to me right now? Well, it shows itself as a situation of engagement with the computer, with the microphone, with the papers and keyboards and all these things. The way that these things show up is, well, he would say, as ready to hand. Right? I know they show up as things that I know what to do with them with. And most of the time, those expectations are not foiled, though sometimes those expectations are foiled and things break down. Of course, that's an ordinary occurrence in everyday life. But to Heidegger, it's a little deeper than that. Because when things break down, all of a sudden, they reveal themselves differently or anew. All of a sudden, they are a problem to attend to. And more of its properties, more of its internal constitution, becomes relevant to human awareness. And all of a sudden, you have to know what went wrong so that you can fix it. So most of the time, things are almost surfaces that serve some pragmatic end. Heidegger uses the term in order to this and the in order to of that. So as you're absorbed in some task, right, you are interfacing with both things or with people when you're interacting with others in a way in such the world does not foil your expectations, but also there is a kind of familiarity that permeates the waters of the world through which you swim. And so, for example, you are in this context, later on you'll go to the bathroom, later on you will get ready to go to work, and the site of where work takes place, well, that's a place where you have your expectations are already ordered by what that site signifies. Or if you go to the play, or if you're all these are modes of engagement with the world, modes of being with others, modes of and all of these know-hows, right? What Heidegger says is all these maybe what look like isolated know-hows take place in a larger context, and that's that's what he calls the world. And in many ways, this world is shared with others, and the things that you do, the things that others do, have public meanings in the sense that you do them not because you have decided from the ground up you are the inception of those things being modes of being. No, you have fallen into those modes of being. Those are the modes of being that have disclosed themselves to you, or you've grown into them by being raised into that world. So that's your thrownness, and that's your facticity. And those are the sort of arbitrary circumstances. So in many ways, you inherit the world in which you dwell in. And not only have you inherited that world, but you also have fallen into it. And the conception of the world orders your possible modes of engagement with it. No, there's much more to say about the concept of world, but we sort of hinted at the notion of breakdown, right? So most of the time, we interface with the world as a kind of, does it work? Do I know? Does it serve its purpose? It's almost like the focal point of Dasein is its attentional existence. And most of the world is in sort of out of focal point, but it signifies. It's sort of like it's blurry, but it blends in with where your attention lies. Now, I just want to put an aside between engagement and disengagement, and because much more could be said about that. But let's say you're absorbed in some task, right? There's something that it's like to be absorbed, to be lost in doing something. Well, Heidegger uses this term where you and the environment are sort of one, right? And when you disengage from it, it's not like you and the environment are uncoupled. You are still in a way coupled, because what you are is being in a world. Everything that you do takes place in a world. And so even when you disengage, you go on to do something else. I wanted to point out that engage and disengage correspond to, in neuroscience, to what are called the default mode network and the task mode network. I got that right? So the default mode network is the ongoing circuitry, the periodic circuitry that is going on in your mind when you are in a kind of default state. This is not an absorbed, attentionally intense state when your attention is sort of laser focused on something specific, but rather when your attention is wide enough. And of course, in most cases, your attention has to be wide enough, and this can be evolutionarily explained or cashed out. You need wide attention to be able to allow all kinds of worldly goings-on to enter your working memory, your sphere of attention, because you might have to respond to it in real time. You might have to avoid some danger or attend to some pressing matter that the environment is signifying or impinging on you for. So the default mode network is, you're not too focused. You are in a mode where you're in a readiness to allow all kinds of worldly goings-on to impinge upon your mode of engagement. On the other hand, the task mode network, this is the circuitry, the periodic circuitry that's ongoing, that is firing when you are in this mode of absorption. So we know that, broadly speaking, there are different neural circuitry that correspond to these different attentional states of being. Again, broadly speaking, you have the default one, and then you have the task one, where you are engaged, absorbed in a task at hand. Now, this absorption in a task at hand is very akin to what... Well, that's probably wrong, but I was going to say is where reason takes place, but it is also where reason takes place, but not only where reason takes place. It's where art takes place. It's where craft takes place. It's where the things that are distinctly human, the products of human creativity, are born out of this mode, the task mode network. Anyhow, that aside, there's much more to say about that, and how Heidegger's ideas sort of are extremely useful and fruitful for cognitive science, for neuroscience, and I consider being in time a hypothesis minefield. Okay, let's leave it at that. The next, where we're going to go later is, so I spoke quite a bit about the world, and I didn't talk about Division 2 of being in time, which covers temporality. So we have the stage of being that is familiar. I should say a little bit about fundamental moods later, and then there is a fundamental mood, a special fundamental mood, termed anxiety or angst, or it's translated differently in different translations. And this is a special type of fundamental mood. And I should have explained that moods are what underlie your engagement or mode of being in the world, in the sense that, right, we spoke about you're engaged, you're in a task mode, you're not in a task mode, you're bored, all these are fundamental moods according to Heidegger, right? They are the global state that describes Dasein's relationship to its world. And in most fundamental moods, these global states differ but do not fundamentally sunder that coupled state with you and the world. So necessarily you are a being that's always in some mode of engagement with its environment. It is your being and what you are, that which determines what you are, right? Your identity in the kind of Aristotelian sense, well, Heidegger's answer is inextricably bound up with your environmental milieu. Well, there is one mood that decouples this relationship, that foregrounds you as distinct from its environment, and that mood is anxiety. And explaining now what anxiety is complicated. One of the reasons why I have been attracted to Heidegger's thought is precisely because before I even was aware of Heidegger, I was sort of interested in detachment. And of course, Eastern philosophy, Eastern thinking, has whole regions of it that are, well, about detachment from the world, right? Not being sort of lost and absorbed in it, but rather being detached from it. And my own thoughts about detachment, right? This is why I latched onto sort of certain strands of Eastern thought, like Taoism early on. And Heidegger's notion of anxiety is his own version of detachment in one way or another. But his description of this fundamental mood is, like I said earlier, his method is phenomenology, so his description is phenomenological. And so he's trying to capture the experience of anxiety and then trying to fit that experience in his sort of existential analytic of Dasein in his broader system of thought. And anxiety is the locus of Heidegger's entire corpus of thought. Anxiety is that which makes Heidegger an extremely interesting philosopher, because, and others have said that, tried to sort of say that Heidegger is not a romantic, but in some sense he's a romantic because he privileges feeling, and not just feeling, but what its likeness, the affective component, as more primordial than the rational logos, explicit formulation, proposition. But not in the sense that he demotes those. Well, in a sense he demotes them, but not in the sense that he is against those. but more in the sense that he's after the larger container in which those things derive their meaningfulness. And they derive their meaningfulness through the basin of affect through which being unfolds. Affect is fundamental to living beings. And we'll get into that and how that is borne out through both empirical science and other sort of schools of thought that have drawn from the well of Heidegger and brought those insights into the fold of cognitive science. And so anxiety is that mood which disrupts Dasein's swimming through its environment, in its envelopment in its world. Through anxiety, Dasein and world decouple. And I'll explain in a bit later what anxiety is. And then we will talk about futurality and temporality in Division 2 and how Dasein can comport itself authentically towards its own possibilities. Okay, so that was a lot, but where we were going to take this later on is through his later thought, like the origin of the work of art. The entire stage of his thought shifts from the interface of Dasein and the world to a much broader stage, the interface of world and earth. And so it's not the individual human being that he is so much concerned with in his later thought, but the entire stage of human beings and their worlding. And their worlding in an earth. And so there's going to be a kind of strife or conflict or contest between the world, and in this case the world is not the individual milieu of the Dasein. Of course, we intimated that that milieu is not Dasein's own, it is a public world. Well, it's both. It is idiosyncratically, it's Haseatically Dasein's in some way, because Dasein will, if it comports so authentically, it will have a hand in fashioning its own world, in inseminating it, the world with its own norms or milieus, its own predilections and preferences. And all those contributions of individual Dasein in constituting the world, they contribute to what world, the larger world, the world of human beings is like. And so in his later thought and the origin of the work of art, we will see a larger stage in the strife between these two abstract characters, between the world and the earth. And as to exactly what that strife is and what these signify, right? What does the world signifies? There's much more to say about that, and what does the earth signify? We will get into later. And then once we have sort of probed a little into how he conceives art and how bound up art is with being, right? So he wants to reinstitute poiesis in being. We will see how then we can motivate a different relationship to technology. The nature of the earth, in its free and unharried bearing and self-enclosure, reveals itself, however, only in the earth's jutting into a world and the opposition of the two. Genuinely poetic projection is the opening up or disclosure of that into which human being, as historical, is already cast. The world whirls, and is more fully in being than the tangible and perceptible realm in which we believe ourselves to be at home. World is never an object that stands before us and can be seen. The world whirls, and is more fully in being than the tangible and perceptible realm in which we believe ourselves to be at home.